Everything you know about the Old West came from a movie, and every movie lied. These 25 facts were buried in Army records, census archives, and court documents that Hollywood never wanted you to find. Stick around until the end. The last one will make you rethink when the Old West really ended. Fact 1. Morphine was the real drug epidemic of the Old West. Everyone knows about saloon whiskey. But the drug that really destroyed the Old West came in little pharmacy bottles. When the Civil War ended in 1865, hundreds of thousands of soldiers came home addicted to morphine. Army doctors injected the substance into the wounded without thinking twice. There was no treatment, no warning. A man would get shot on the battlefield and come out of the war dependent on it for the rest of his life. In frontier towns, any pharmacy sold morphine and laudanum without a prescription to anyone who wanted it, and for whatever reason. By 1880, there were more morphine addicts in these towns than alcoholics. And here comes the fact nobody talks about. Historians estimate that more cowboys died from overdoses and withdrawal complications than in all the documented shootouts of the era combined. Hollywood never touched this subject. Fact 2. The OK Corral was as wide as a hallway. Forget everything you've seen in the movies. The shootout at the OK Corral didn't happen on a wide street with dust flying around. It happened in a tight 6-foot alley. You could touch both walls by stretching out your arms. Now imagine cramming 9 armed men into that space. It was 2 groups staring each other down from handshake distance, so close that 3 of them had gunpowder burns on their skin before they even felt the bullets. The whole showdown lasted about 30 seconds. 30 seconds of chaos in a space the size of a bathroom. Hollywood always showed it as a duel out in the open because a narrow hallway doesn't look good on the big screen. But if you go to Tombstone, Arizona today, the original lot is still there. And the first thing everyone thinks when they see it is, how did anyone make it out of that alive? Fact 3. The Plains tribes didn't have horses for 10,000 years. Here's a fact few people stop to think about. Horses disappeared from North America along with the mammoths about 10,000 years ago. Completely vanished. So every movie scene showing native warriors on horseback before 1700 is pure fiction. The Spanish brought horses back in the 1500s, but it was the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico that changed everything. When native people drove out the colonizers, Spanish horse herds spread across the Southwest. And here's the impressive part. In just 30 years, tribes that had never gone near a horse mastered riding like no one else in history. That whole Plains warrior culture Hollywood sold for decades was built in less time than it takes to pay off a car loan. Fact 4. Deadwood existed outside the law, and the government knew it. You think Deadwood became a lawless land by accident? Think again. In 1874, Custer confirmed there was gold in the Black Hills. The problem? That land belonged to the Sioux under the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. The government knew, the Army knew. And nobody lifted a finger to stop the prospectors who invaded the region. For 2 years, Deadwood operated without a court, without a sheriff with any real jurisdiction, without federal law. Every contract signed there, every land deed, every murder trial was worthless paper. The government looked the other way because it wanted the gold, but didn't want the responsibility. When they recognized the territory in 1877, it was after forcing a new treaty that took the Black Hills from the Sioux. The most famous lawless town in the Old West wasn't born out of chaos. It was born from a calculated decision. Fact 5. Tombstone was destroyed by water, not bullets. Everyone thinks Tombstone came to an end because of shootouts and outlaws. The truth is very different. In 1886, the silver mines beneath the town started filling with water. Water pumps were installed to fix the problem, but they failed. The town leaders raised more than $600,000, the equivalent of about $18 million today, to try to fix everything. It didn't work. The water kept rising non-stop. In less than a year and a half, 3 out of every 4 residents packed up and left. Think about that for a second. It wasn't the Cowboys. It wasn't Wyatt Earp. It wasn't any bullet that killed Tombstone. It was the water table. The most feared town in the Old West lost the fight to something no one could see, much less shoot at. No Western movie is going to tell you that part of the story. Fact 6. The Dalton gang robbed the town where they grew up. In October 1892, the Dalton brothers decided to do something no outlaw in the Old West had ever tried before. Rob 2 banks at the same time. The problem? They picked Coffeyville, Kansas, the town where they grew up, where everyone knew their faces. The townspeople realized what was happening and ran to the nearest hardware store. They grabbed rifles and shotguns. When the gang came out of the banks, they found an entire town armed and waiting. The shootout lasted less than 5 minutes. 4 of the 5 Daltons died right there in the street. But 4 Coffeyville residents were also killed, including the marshal. It was the bloodiest robbery in the history of the American West. And all because the Daltons thought nobody would have the guts to stand up to someone who used to be their neighbor. Fact 7. Baseball was the real obsession of the Old West. You grew up watching Western movies with shootouts and duels at sunset. But the favorite pastime of the Old West didn't involve revolvers. It was baseball. By 1882, pretty much every cattle town in the American West already had an organized team. Cowboys would leave the herd behind and head to the field to play. Miners formed leagues with actual championships. Dodge City had a team with matching uniforms, serious stuff. And there's more. They say Wyatt Earp, the same guy from the Tombstone shootouts, played outfield. In 1886, the mining town of Leadville, Colorado, built a stadium for 3,000 people just to watch the Leadville Blues play. Hollywood never showed any of this. It chose revolvers instead. But the people who lived back then chose the bat and the ball. Fact 8. The U.S. Army officially ordered the extermination of the bison. In 1800, between 30 and 60 million bison lived on the Great Plains. By 1889, only 325 were left. It wasn't overhunting or an accident. It was military strategy. General Philip Sheridan put it in writing in official correspondence. If you want to defeat the Plains peoples, kill the bison. No food, no resistance. And the government did exactly that. Professional hunters killed up to 250 bison a day, and the Army backed the operation with ammunition, transportation, and armed escorts. In less than a century, tens of millions became a few hundred. Think about that. The American government deliberately funded the extinction of an entire species as a weapon of war against its own territory. This isn't in school textbooks, and most Americans have never heard of it. Fact 9. Dodge City's homicide rate was lower than Baltimore's today. You probably picture Dodge City as a place where shootouts happened every week. In reality, during its worst years, the town recorded about 1.5 murders per year. Tombstone, less than 1. Historian Robert Dykstra dug into the actual death records from the 5 most famous cattle towns. The combined number of violent deaths over 5 full years was lower than the monthly average of any American city today. To give you an idea, the entire Kansas Territory in 1808 had fewer homicides than Baltimore records in a single week nowadays. Movies multiplied the violence of the Old West by a factor of 100. What you know as the Western is basically an invention of Los Angeles screenwriters. Fact 10. No one really knows what the fifth card in the dead man's hand was. Wild Bill Hickok was shot in the back on August 2nd, 96, inside a saloon in Deadwood. The cards fell on the table, 2 aces and 2 eights. That much the records confirm. Now the fifth card? No witness wrote down what it was. No one. 0 reports from the time mentioned that card. And there's more. The term dead man's hand only showed up in 1926 in a book by a second-rate writer named Frank Wilstash. Half a century after the murder, the guy basically invented the legend and stuck it onto Hickok. Since then, every Hollywood movie, every poker table, every reference to that hand repeats a story no one actually witnessed. The most famous hand in poker history is incomplete. And the missing detail is exactly the one everyone thinks they know. Fact 11. In the 1800s, going to the dentist in the Wild West was exactly what you'd imagine. No anesthesia, no painkiller, just some guy with pliers and maybe a swig of whiskey. But around 1884, a doctor named Carl Kohler discovered that a compound extracted from coca leaves could numb tissue. Dentists adopted it right away. By the mid-1880s, traveling dentists in frontier towns were injecting this substance straight into the gums before pulling teeth. It was the first time in history that a real local anesthetic existed. The problem? Nobody understood the side effects. Patients came back not to get their teeth treated, but because they felt a physical need for the substance. They became dependent in a dentist's chair, not in some dark alley. Entire towns started having problems that nobody could explain. Fact 12. Lightning killed more cowboys than bullets. On the Great Plains, a man on horseback was the tallest thing for miles around, and lightning doesn't miss its target. Records from the big cattle drives of the 1870s show something few people would imagine. More cowboys died from lightning strikes than from shootouts, stampedes, and snake bites combined. And the riskiest job wasn't being a gunslinger, it was being the trail cook. The guy spent all day next to a metal wagon and a cast iron stove out in the open, right when the afternoon storms rolled in. Veteran cowhands knew the danger. When they heard the first clap of thunder, they let go of the horses and dropped to the ground. Surviving wasn't about courage, it was about knowing when to duck. Fact 13, the pony. Express was a financial disaster that lasted 19 months. Everyone grew up hearing that the Pony Express was one of the great achievements of the Wild West. Movies sold that idea for decades. But the business was a disaster from start to finish. It opened in April 1860 and shut down in October 1801. 19 months. The 3 partners, William Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Waddell, lost the equivalent of $6 million today. They all went bankrupt. What killed the operation was the transcontinental telegraph. The day the lines connected from coast to coast, the Pony Express became a museum piece. Overnight, riding for days on end to deliver a letter made no sense at all. The riders were real and risked their lives on every trip. But the business model never stood a chance. It's proof that courage doesn't save a bad plan. Fact 14. Starting in 1860, newspapers in the American West began publishing ads from lonely men looking for wives. Women from the East would answer, sell everything they owned, take trains and stagecoaches for weeks, and go meet a stranger. The problem? Most of these guys lied about everything. They said they had farms when they didn't even own a piece of land. They said they were single when they were already married. Some women arrived and found a man completely different from what they expected. And the worst part? There were no refunds, no laws protecting these women. and going back home wasn't an option because they had already sold everything. It's estimated that thousands went through this. The story of mail-order brides is usually told like something romantic, but in practice, it was one of the longest and quietest scams of the westward expansion. Fact 15. The man who owned the land where the gold rush started died in poverty. In January 1848, a worker named James Marshall found gold on John Sutter's land in the Sacramento Valley. And that's exactly what ruined Sutter. Thousands of prospectors took over everything. They killed the cattle, tore down buildings, and occupied every piece of land. Sutter tried to go to court, but the courts were a mess, and the government didn't lift a finger for him. Think about it. The guy owned the place where it all began, and he couldn't protect a single acre. He spent the next 32 years chasing Congress for compensation. He never got a penny. In June 1880, Sutter died in a cheap hotel room in Washington, completely broke. The man whose property kicked off the biggest rush for wealth in American history ended up with nowhere to go and nothing to his name. Fact 16. From 30 to 40% of men in the West lived under fake names. You think you know the names of the big figures of the Wild West? Think again. Census records from towns like Tombstone and Deadwood show that between 30 and 40% of adult men gave names that didn't appear in any earlier documents. Deserters, escaped convicts, bigamists, men buried in debt back east. They all crossed the Mississippi and became someone else. The frontier worked like a machine for erasing pasts. All you had to do was make up a name, shake a stranger's hand, and that was it. A new life. But it came at a cost. Many outlaws, gamblers, and even sheriffs we know by famous nicknames never had their real names discovered. Their families, their origins, all of it was lost. They died as characters they had created themselves, and nobody knew who they really were. Fact 17. The average outlaw career lasted 4 years. You probably picture Wild West outlaws spending years on the run, robbing banks and escaping the law. The reality was very different. Documents from the time show that an outlaw's career lasted an average of 4.2 years, and most of them didn't even make it to 25. But what killed these guys wasn't bullets. It was the desert, hunger, cold, disease, hiding out with no shelter, no food, and nobody to help. It was a miserable life, not an adventure. Jesse James broke every statistic. He stayed in crime for 15 years and only died at 34, shot by a member of his own gang. No historian has found another outlaw with a track record like that. He was such a rare exception that he ended up becoming the rule in people's minds. The myth of the tough outlaw was born from a case that was never repeated. Fact 18. In 1880, San Francisco had 316 officially licensed opium dens, not hidden in alleyways, operating on commercial streets with their doors wide open. Lawyers, merchants, politicians, respectable people went to these places, and it was on record. But when they started banning opium in the 1870s, nobody talked about public health. The laws targeted the Chinese. The wording was surgical. It criminalized smoking opium in a pipe, the Chinese method, but kept opium tinctures that doctors prescribed to white clients completely legal. Same drug, 2 different treatments under the law. The first anti-drug laws in the United States weren't created to protect anyone. They were written to persecute one specific ethnic group and call it public policy. That's the kind of thing that doesn't show up in school books. Fact 19. Scalp bounties were a European invention, not a Native American practice. You know that classic Western movie scene where the native warrior shows up holding a scalp like a war trophy? Yeah, the real story is very different from what Hollywood sold us for decades. In 1694, The Massachusetts Bay Colony passed an official law paying $100 in silver for every Native American scalp turned in to the authorities. That's right. British, French, and Dutch colonial governments set up bounty programs that turned human heads into merchandise. Many tribes only began practicing scalping on a large scale after Europeans put a price on it. The same colonizers who created this gruesome market later pointed their fingers at Native people and said they were savages. A flipped narrative that lasted for centuries. Fact 20. 78% of the Wells Fargo robberies were inside jobs. Between 1870 and 1884, the Pinkerton Agency investigated 313 Wells Fargo stagecoach robberies. The result? Almost 8 out of 10 cases had people inside the company involved. Employees, station agents, and inside contacts passed information about shipments and schedules to the bandits. That story about the clever outlaw surprising a stagecoach in the middle of the desert was almost always a lie. In practice, the masked cowboy was just hired labor. The real criminal wore a tie and worked in the office. The Wild West Hollywood sold us was very different from reality. Most of these crimes were organized fraud, planned by people who knew the system from the inside. White-collar crime isn't a modern invention. It already existed back when stagecoaches were still crossing the country. Fact 21. In Kansas in 880, women owned 15% of all land officially registered in county records. 15%. In a place we picture as being dominated by cowboys and gunslingers. The reality is that the frontier killed men at an absurd rate. Disease, accidents, fights, work that was way too hard. And when a husband died, the land passed to his wife. But many of them didn't just manage what they inherited. They went further. Women who arrived in the West working as maids or entertainers ended their lives as owners of several plots of land, with people working for them. Historian Julie Roy Jeffrey found dozens of these cases in court records from the time. Real documentation, not folklore. But Hollywood never told that story. The studios needed the helpless damsel waiting to be saved. The woman who owned a farm didn't sell tickets. Fact 22. The whole Wild West fit into an area smaller than Indiana. You grew up watching westerns thinking half of America was lawless territory. But the truth is very different. The gunfight at the OK Corral, the cattle drives through Dodge City, Billy the Kid, the gold rush in Deadwood, all of it happened in a strip of land that doesn't even cover the state of Indiana. We're talking about around 3% of American territory, and it didn't last for centuries. It was a 20-year thing, concentrated in a handful of counties. Hollywood took that little piece and turned it into an entire continent of chaos. Meanwhile, the other 97% of the West was farms, ranches, and quiet little towns where life went on with no drama at all. They were places so calm, they would never make a movie. They worked well precisely because they were boring. Fact 23. Before movies even existed, one man already had an audience of 50 million. Long before Hollywood filmed its first Western, a former Army scout was already packing arenas around the world. William Cody, Buffalo Bill, took his Wild West show on the road for 30 straight years. It's estimated that 50 million people saw it live. In 1883, while Chicago was hosting the Great World's Fair, he put on 318 performances in a single season, making more money than any theater show in the country. The cast had 640 workers, 500 horses, real bison, and native performers staging stagecoach attacks. Cody wasn't just remembering the Wild West. He was creating the version the public came to believe was real. When movie studios finally came along, they didn't have to invent anything. They just copied the script Buffalo Bill had already written live, night after night. Fact 24. Cowboy boots were a symbol of debt, not freedom. Have you ever noticed how every Western shows the cowboy wearing those nice boots like he owns the world? Well, the reality was very different. Around 85, a pair of custom-made boots cost between $15 and $20. Sounds cheap, right? But a trail cowboy made about $25 a month. In other words, those boots were worth almost 3 months of hard work under the sun and dust. Most of these guys bought them on credit. Through the company's own credit system, they handed over their wages as collateral and spent the entire first season just paying off the footwear. That symbol of freedom we associate with the Wild West was actually a financial chain. The cowboy riding free across the plains was almost always doing it while owing every cent on those boots. Fact 25. Hollywood declared that the Wild West ended in 1890. Reality completely disagrees. The last confirmed stagecoach robbery in the U.S. happened in December 1916 in Nevada. That's right, cars were already on the streets and there were still bandits stopping stagecoaches. The last major long-trail cattle drive didn't end until 1940 in Arizona. And here's the detail that really hits. The last man imprisoned for crimes from the classic Wild West era died in a federal penitentiary in 1955. Eisenhower was already president. That famous closing of the frontier in 1890 that everyone repeats was just a classification from the U.S. Census. Bureaucracy on paper, not reality on the ground. The practices, the economy, and the violence of the West kept going strong for another half-century after movie studios had already decided that story was over.